Lindbergh. Lindbergh is coming down.
Celebrated hero. Infamous racist.
It is the European race we must preserve.
To some, a patriot. To others, a traitor. A private, even prudish man who recklessly fathers 3 secret families at the same time. Startling revelations about the 20th century's greatest celebrity expose the private man behind the fame. The real Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh is just 25 when he becomes the world's most famous man. The first to fly solo from New York to Paris.
He was catapulted from this relatively unknown, boyish aviator into this global figure. There's just no precedent for the reaction to him.
5 years later, in 1932, his stardom leads to the tragic kidnapping of his firstborn son. Yet only now, 80 years after his famous flight, are we seeing the mind of the man behind the legend. He's constantly driven to take enormous risks, yet he thrives on discipline and insists on being in control.
One thing that really bothered him was that the press called him Lucky Lindy. Because as far as Lindbergh was concerned, luck had nothing to do with it.
Once he conquers the Atlantic, he increasingly behaves as if he can accomplish anything. From finding his missing son,
We have not confidence in our leaders.
to challenging
We have
a
not
president.
confidence in their efficiency or in their judgment.
This is a mindset you're dealing with this man. See, when he believes he's right, he is not going to deviate.
He's been called the lone eagle, and he was a lone eagle in so many different ways.
Lindbergh's risk-taking and his need for control likely spring from a restlessness, which took root early. He loves his family's Minnesota farm, but rarely spends more than a few months there. Instead, he travels frequently between the farm, his mother's Detroit home, and Washington, D.C., where his father is serving in the U.S. Congress. He makes few friends.
His parents essentially had a loveless marriage. His parents really never lived together after Lindbergh turned 3.5, I think. He spent the rest of his childhood moving around the country with his mother.
His mother even moves in with him when he enrolls in college. He flunks out anyway and seeks freedom in the air. The flirtation with danger gives him a feeling of immortality, like being a god. He joins a flying circus as an acrobat. Then he hones his piloting skills in the Army Air Corps. In 1926, Lindbergh jumps at the challenge to fly for the brand new airmail service. Forced to face bad weather to keep the mail flowing, 31 out of 40 pilots crash and die. Lindbergh, however, repeatedly escapes danger, earning the nicknames Lucky Lindy and the Flying Fool.
Charles Lindbergh was a maverick and a daredevil. He ran into trouble several times, but each time, as the plane was diving, he stood on the wing and he jumped. That's why people thought he was crazy.
Ein Verrückter.
Flying the Mail convinces Lindbergh he has the nerves and the know-how to enter the New York to Paris race. A rich hotel owner named Raymond Ortigue is offering $25,000 to the first person to fly non-stop between the two cities. Lindbergh believes he can win, but only if he can do it his way. His competitors plan to fly multi-engine planes with crews of at least 2 men. Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis, named for his backer's hometown, has just one engine, and its pilot will fly alone.
And so here you have this lone eagle, if you will, this seemingly reckless pilot. People thought this was a suicidal mission.
He'll have to stay awake behind the controls for more than 30 hours. But the skeptics do not shake his resolve. He plans the rest of his flight with the same cold eye.
Lindbergh made a very scientific study of what he thought would be required to make this flight. He thought a radio was excess weight. He thought a fuel gauge was excess weight. He would instead track fuel consumption with his watch.
A parachute had saved Lindbergh's life 4 times. But now, in his coldest calculation, he decides to save 20 pounds, and he throws it out. The lighter load lets him carry more gas, which he stows right behind the engine.
The fuel tank that he added was a terrible thing. To see where he was going, he had to lean left or right and get around the edges of that tank.
He never loses doubt, even as his prospects darken. Several competitors crash, trying to get their overburdened planes to fly. 4 are killed. Still, the race continues, and Lindbergh now has no time to lose. On May 20th, 1927, he seizes his chance. He has barely slept. If he takes off now, he faces the dangers of flying more than 30 hours on just 3 hours sleep. Yet that is what he decides to do.
I think he could argue a strong case that that was a mistaken judgment. The idea of a transatlantic flight with just a couple of hours sleep the night before, that's kind of a horrifying beginning.
The tank, Lindbergh added, not only makes it impossible to see out the front, it makes the Spirit enormously unstable and exhausting to fly. If he lets go for more than 2 seconds, the plane veers out of control. His flight plan takes him over Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, then across the open Atlantic for 2,000 miles. It is here, over the storm-tossed seas, that he meets the greatest danger. "14 hours in, Lindbergh spots ice on the struts. He maneuvers. He must find warmer air, or the extra weight could send him plunging into the sea. It works. But his battle is just beginning. Ahead, he faces more storms and ice, while completely oblivious to the frenzy building below. Thousands call the New York Times for updates on the lone flyer. At Yankee Stadium, a boxing match is underway. An announcer urges the crowd to say a silent prayer for Lindbergh. 40,000 spectators comply. Hundreds of miles from land, Lindbergh needs all the saving graces he can get. He's falling asleep.
Hey, John, 5 more minutes and we're out of here.
Charles Lindbergh has made it more than halfway from New York to Paris. But for 11 hours, he's been fighting to keep his plane from icing up and dropping into the ocean. The exhausted flyer can take no more. He falls asleep. No one is at the controls of the Spirit of St. Louis. It begins to dive. But now, the instability of Lindbergh's craft becomes a blessing. The dive jolts him awake. He is completely unprepared for what happens next. After 33.5 hours in the air, he reaches Paris. And a sea of 150,000 swarms his plane.
He emerged from his plane and was nearly trampled to death. This was something he did not expect. He had no idea that this would make him the most famous man on Earth.
It's only the beginning.
When I landed at Lindbergh, I landed with the expectancy of being able to see Europe. And I was informed that while it wasn't an order to come back home, that there'd be a battleship waiting for me next week.
He goes to New York, where 4 million people attend the largest ticker tape parade in history. He then goes on a 3-month victory lap around America, and he's seen in the flesh by 30 million people. This is when our total population was 120 million. So 1 in 4 Americans had seen Charles Lindbergh in person.
But the fame soon sours. His tour over, Lindbergh decides to retreat into relative anonymity. And he grows increasingly frustrated when the press and the public won't let him. He marries Anne Morrow, the daughter of a wealthy financier, in a small, private ceremony. The press responds by stalking him on their honeymoon. A year later, when Anne gives birth, he tries to withhold the news.
The birth was practically kept a secret. First photograph was not released for about a week and a half afterwards. And then Lindbergh's attitude was he hoped they would all go away and leave them in peace.
Instead, the papers trumpet the news on the front page.
When Charles A. Lindbergh Jr. was born, he received more attention in the world press than the birth of royal children.
Finally, Lindbergh seeks to seclude his family on a 400-acre estate in New Jersey. Even that doesn't work. It's not long before gawkers are driving by. And one decides to go even farther, thrusting Lindbergh into another frenzy, but this time with tragic results. March 1st, 1932. Lindbergh arrives home at 8:30. His son's nurse, Betty Gao, has already put the 20-month-old baby to bed. In keeping with the custom of the times, Lindbergh does not look in on him. At 10 p.m., Betty enters the nursery to turn up the heat. She is alarmed when she does not hear the boy. It is Lindbergh who finds the note. His firstborn son has been kidnapped. His efforts to secure his family's safety and privacy have failed. But he does not despair. He takes charge. He grabs his rifle and starts the search. It is the beginning of one of America's most sensational criminal cases, and it spawns a massive manhunt. But Lindbergh soon loses patience when the dragnet turns up footprints and a handmade ladder, but no baby. He takes over the case.
Im Kidnapping-Fall selber hat
He took command.
das Oberkommando.
He told the journalists what they had to write.
Hat allerdings den Journalisten diktiert, was sie schreiben sollen.
He searched the premises for evidence, which the police might have missed. He was convinced that only he would be able to solve the case.
Werden kann dann nur durch ihn.
Lindbergh's quest propels him on a bizarre odyssey. He suppresses his own emotions and orders his wife not to cry.
She cried frequently. Charles, according to her diary, never cried once. She slowly came to realize he didn't really feel it the same way.
He even accepts the help of gangsters.
The police were living in his house. There were even a few members of a local crime gang in New York who spent time in the house. There's two low-level gangsters are answering the Lindbergh's phones, flipping cigar ash on the carpet and bossing everybody around.
Then, Lindbergh receives a call from a school teacher named John Condon. Condon has succeeded on his own in contacting the kidnapper through an ad in a newspaper. Lindbergh accepts Condon as his intermediary, and he joins him at a New York cemetery when he goes to meet the kidnapper. Lindbergh brings $50,000 in ransom.
The state police and the local police were not kept up to speed with what Lindbergh and Condon were planning. The police did not know about it, and there was no stakeout of the place.
To ensure the baby's safe return, Lindbergh has made a grave concession. He agrees to exchange the money, not for the child, but for a tip on the baby's whereabouts. The tip is a dead end. Six weeks later, a trucker stops near the Lindbergh estate. He innocently ventures into the woods to answer a call of nature. And he stumbles upon a baby's decomposing corpse. Charles Lindbergh Jr. is dead, his skull fractured. The autopsy reveals he died the night he was taken. Lindbergh's quest to save his son was doomed from the very start, and he has let the kidnapper slip away.
His extraordinary abilities at control and manipulating forces in life fell short. He couldn't do it.
It takes the police more than 2 years to nab a suspect, Bruno Richard Hauptmann. In 1935, when Hauptmann's trial opens in New Jersey, Lindbergh is thrust again into another media circus.
place was literally wired. I mean, thousands of wires coming in because reporters from all over the world wanted to cover this particular case.
Lindberghs, whenever they appeared at the courthouse, had to go through this gauntlet of pushing crowds and screaming people. Souvenir hawkers selling little ladders to mimic the ladder that was used to kidnap the child.
On the first day, reporters spot a gun beneath Lindbergh's jacket, prompting speculation that he'll use it and kill his child's alleged murderer.
Do you remember?
The trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann lasts 6 weeks. Charles Lindbergh leaves his grieving wife at home and attends every session. As he did when the baby disappeared, he shuts down his emotions and buries himself in the facts.
He quit his job the day he collected the $50,000. The very day.
On February 13th, 1935, the jury convicts Hauptmann of murder. Lindbergh rarely discusses the tragedy again, except to insist on Hauptmann's guilt. And he and Anne Morrow go on to have 5 more children. But now, he is more determined than ever to keep his family safe. He trains a German shepherd to sleep by his children's beds. And when he receives threats against his second son, he takes his family to live in England. Ironically, Lindbergh's quest for order and privacy soon leads him back into the spotlight. He lands in England as Nazi Germany is on the rise. And his admiration for Hitler's regime propels him into politics, with disastrous results. His troubles begin in 1936, when an American official asks him to visit Nazi Germany to assess Hitler's burgeoning air force. Lindbergh eagerly leaps at the offer, and the Nazis give America's great hero unparalleled access.
He toured factories, he flew their latest model aircraft, and he gathered an enormous amount of intelligence data on the Germans.
Lindbergh is impressed with German order and discipline, and he returns repeatedly between 1936 and 1938.
This was a country, in his mind, that was virile. It was a country that was committed to science, technology, and aviation. He probably never would have liked to admit this. He was very impressed with all of these virile men dressed in the same uniform, saluting at the same time.
He is not alarmed by the Nazis' increasing intolerance. He sympathizes with Hitler's desire to assure the purity of the German race. Lindbergh is a proponent of eugenics, the idea that the strong should breed together and the weak should be allowed to wither. And he believes the strongest of all races are Europe's Christian whites.
Eugenics teaches that it's not a coincidence if some people are smarter and more talented. It's all connected to the sperm of the producer. And he was convinced that his sperm was especially good.
Lindbergh's intelligence work convinces him that Germany is too strong to be defeated. He decides he must take on an even larger political role and keep America out of the war. He abandons his exile and returns to the United States to raise a direct challenge to the popular president, Franklin Roosevelt.
There certainly was a lot of hubris in taking on such a big cause.
We lack only a leadership that places America first.
I think he thought, if I'm the one who has to do it, I will do it. He knew he would be listened to, and he was right.
We have divided our own people by this doubling in Europe's wars.
He tours the country, his views growing bolder and more extreme.
It is now obvious that England is losing the war.
He opposes aid to the British, even as German bombs rain on their homeland.
We cannot win this war for England regardless of how much assistance we send.
He insists the war will lead to such total destruction, the communists will take over.
He said we should not have the powers, the great political powers of the white world, fight each other so that the Asians can take over. And he considered the Russians as Asians.
Racial strength is vital. It is the European race we must preserve.
But Lindbergh has grossly underestimated Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt taps his phones, while his aides call the aviator a Nazi. Then, on September 11, 1941, he makes a speech that forever ruins his reputation. 3 groups, he says, are leading America into war. He blames the Roosevelt administration and the British. He also blames America's Jews.
And then he goes on, using almost stock phrases, that the Jews have a disproportionate influence in movies, in the press, in radio, and in the government. Now, what is he doing? He is saying, with almost overtones of conspiracy, that they are manipulating the rest of us.
To many, Lindbergh is echoing Hitler's propaganda and confirming White House accusations that he's a pro-Nazi traitor.
Was Lindbergh a Nazi? I don't believe he was. But I think he did think that Jews were not fully white or fully American. I think he thought the Jews had an agenda of their own.
The outrage is voluminous.
Newspapers all over America ran editorials condemning the speech. And he was shocked. He was shocked.
To show you how kind of out of it Lindbergh is, when this is raised several years later in the 1960s, he will say to friends who are talking about this, they didn't listen to the rest of the speech. Nobody talks about the rest of the speech. You know, like Mrs. Lincoln, aside from that, how did the play go, you know?
In less than 15 years, Charles Lindbergh has plummeted from hero to pariah. But he is not done taking risks. Years later, his reputation will suffer yet another blow when rumors surface about his complex personal life. Charles Lindbergh never apologizes for his admiration of Nazi Germany, even after its atrocities become clear.
He made no apologies. The Russians took over Eastern Europe. That's what he was concerned about. That's what was the worst thing he thought could happen. Well, it did happen.
As some see it, Lindbergh is not just stubborn, he suffers an acute moral blindness. He values science and order over the emotion and unpredictability of human interaction. He never again dallies in national politics. But his disgrace doesn't squelch his drive. It also does not seem to shake his belief that he can do almost anything. He has enraged the government by opposing the war. But now, he decides he wants to fight anyway.
And the Secretary of War tells him, I really don't want you. I don't know if you're committed to our victory. And so Lindbergh was essentially blackballed from being in the armed services. He was crushed.
But he's not deterred. He soon finds a way to join the war as a civilian. At age 42, he goes to the Pacific as a military contractor. He teaches pilots techniques for saving fuel to increase their range. He flies 50 combat missions. He even engages in a dogfight and wins.
The interesting thing, again, is how dogged and stubborn he was. He wanted to contribute to the war, and he did in some very significant ways.
In war, in politics, and in the air, Charles Lindbergh is willing to cross boundaries that would stop almost everyone else.
Having succeeded in that flight over the Atlantic Ocean by himself to France, did it make him think that limits applied only to other people?
Nowhere does Lindbergh test the limits more liberally than in his personal life. While alive, he makes sure the public sees him as a devoted husband and father. It is not until decades after his death, in 1974, that the first clues emerge to tarnish that image. In 2003, Dirk, Astrid, and David Heshammer come forward with startling claims. They say that from 1957 to 1974, Lindbergh had an affair with their mother, Brigitte. They also insist Lindbergh is their father.
For me, it's my father. For you all, it could be Charles Lindbergh. I don't really care. I'm proud of it, but that is not what's important for me.
He showed up at their home near Munich about 3 times a year, always carrying the same brown leather suitcase. The children knew him, not as a famous aviator, but as Carew Kent, an American businessman who entertained them over long pancake breakfasts.
When we were talking with my mother, why can't he turn up more often? She said, well, he's a very busy man. I knew he was more than a writer or businessman. I thought he must have been some important person.
The Heshammers say they did not learn the truth about their father's identity until Lindbergh died and their mother confessed. It was not until Brigitte Heshammer also died in 2001 that the children came forward.
We just thought, well, it's time to stop that secret. I think it's very important that we made this step for the next generation.
Anne Morrow died in 2001 without revealing any suspicions that her husband had a secret life. And the couple's children have described shock at the Heshammers' claims. Could Charles Lindbergh have really hidden a family in Europe for decades? To answer the skeptics, the Heshammers turned to Munich's top crime lab. In 2003, geneticists ran a comparison between the Heshammers' DNA and that of an acknowledged Lindbergh grandson who agreed to cooperate. The results were unequivocal.
It is
99.7% certain that all those we tested have the same male ancestor. Charles Lindbergh is with high probability the father of Dirk Heshammer.
Dirk still lives in the house Lindbergh built for his mother. He has more than 100 letters from his father, and they contain shocking details about his philandering. Incredibly, the Heshammers are not Charles Lindbergh's only secret family. The aviator fathered 4 more children in Europe by 2 other women.
Altogether, he had 3 lovers. And within almost exactly 10 years, he had 7 children.
He went to extraordinary lengths to keep it all secret. And his methods are only now becoming public.
There's a world of investment opportunities out there.
but spotting them takes perspective. It takes experts on the ground, assessing potential and
The amazing story of Charles Lindbergh's 3 covert families begins in 1957. His nearly constant travel is taking a heavy toll on his wife and children.
By this time, Lindbergh's marriage was kind of a sham. He was spending 8 or 9 months of the year away from his wife.
When he is home, his family finds his presence oppressive.
Die amerikanischen Kinder
The American children described him as a very caring father, but also a strict father. He prepared lists of what the children were to do when he was gone.
To-do list, wenn weg war.
He took a carbon copy of the to-do list with him, and when he came back, he checked it off.
Lindbergh is no less strict with his wife, forcing her to keep track of every household expenditure. He rarely tells her where he's headed next.
You know, there once was a moment where President Johnson called Anne Morrow and said, "I'd like to invite you and your husband to the White House." And she said, "Well, I'd love to come, but I have no idea where my husband is."
We now know that Lindbergh is flying frequently to Munich, Germany, to work as an airline and U.S. military consultant. There, he begins an affair with his secretary, known as Valeska.
Valeska mit Charles Lindbergh folgte.
In March 1957, Valeska and Charles Lindbergh went to a party together, where he met Valeska's friends, the Hesheimer sisters.
Lindbergh is intrigued with the 2 sisters, but especially Brigitte, a hat maker 26 years his junior. All 3 women speak English, and they chat with Lindbergh about the Cold War.
And as the evening wore on, Brigitte Hesheimer said, "Whether or not there's going to be a war, the nicest thing to do is to have children, because children are the future."
It seems that comment is the seed of a relationship that will last almost 2 decades. Lindbergh begins escorting Brigitte Hesheimer around Munich, even as he continues his relationship with Valeska. Soon, he's also having an affair with Brigitte's sister, Marietta. Marietta Hesheimer and Valeska each have 2 children by Charles Lindbergh. And both families have assiduously avoided public exposure.
Das Geheimnis von Lindbergh.
He did not only take the secret to his grave, but all his women stayed silent as the grave as well.
In his letters to Dirk's mother, Lindbergh writes about his other families. The letters also reveal how he keeps the relationships secret.
Brigitte und mit Sicherheit auch Marietta und mit Sicherheit.
He gave Brigitte, Marietta, and Valeska a P.O. box, where all 3 sent their letters. For security reasons, he constantly changed this P.O. box.
Immer wieder gewechselt.
His last letter, scribbled on his deathbed, gives his final instructions.
My love to you and the children, all I can send. And then the postscript, hold the utmost secrecy. Secrecy he's even writing in block letters.
Und einen identischen Brief.
Valeska has the exact identical letter.
Wahrscheinlich gibt es also auch einen bei Marietta.
We think that Marietta has one as well. He tells his lovers that the children are taken care of and that accounts will be opened for them.
This is a phenomenal bit of organization again. It's not unlike going across the Atlantic, isn't it? All the itinerary that has to be developed, the sequence of seeing people, the concealment. I mean, it's an enormous undertaking.
And it leads to a rather strange life. Lindbergh flies to Germany 3 to 4 times a year and starts his circuit. First stop, Baden-Baden. Home to Valeska, a son and a daughter. Next, he drives to Switzerland, home of Marietta and 2 more sons. Finally, he heads to Munich, to Brigitte and their 3 children. Lindbergh spends just days with each family on each visit. Within 3 weeks, he is back in Frankfurt and off to his next destination.
Nennen wir es mal Tour d'amour.
Call it the Tour d'Amour, the love route of Charles Lindbergh.
He did love his children in his own way. He was a family man, but he was the kind of family man who was rarely at home with his family.
It's a remarkable transformation. The young Lindbergh is abstemious, almost prudish, even after achieving global celebrity. He is a virgin on his wedding night. Yet by age 70, he has 4 families and has fathered 13 children. Some blame Lindbergh's late life hedonism on the disintegration of his marriage. But others see a motive that can be traced to his youth, his belief in the superiority of his Nordic genes.
Ich glaube, das war ganz
These children are in total agreement with his ideological beliefs,
dass es möglichst viele
to put as many Lindberghs as possible into this world.
Lindbergh often talked to his children and said, you should have many children. And the reason you should have many children is that you will be passing on a superior gene pool.
Although Lindbergh never loses his faith in his bloodline, he does revise many of his early beliefs. On his flights over the decades, he sees the devastating spread of human sprawl. His faith in science and technology wanes, and he becomes a fervent environmentalist.
He becomes very disillusioned with science and disillusioned with rationality in general. That science is not restoring Eden to us. Science is creating a Frankenstein monster.
He also seems to regret his white supremacist beliefs. He makes a point of visiting indigenous tribes to find out what he can learn. He even starts to see his lifelong love, aviation, as a threat to nature.
He makes a famous comment in one of his books that he'd rather have a bird than a plane. If he had to choose between a bird and a plane, he would take a bird.
Charles Lindbergh never loses his will to control his destiny, and his wanderlust never dies. But in 1973, he chooses the place that will be his last stop, the remote end of Hawaii's Maui Island. Here, Lindbergh can escape humanity and revel in nature more thoroughly than anywhere else in America. In the shadow of a rainforest preserve he helped create, he finds his burial site. In July 1974, he learns he's about to die of lymphoma, and he makes his last transoceanic voyage to Maui. On his deathbed, he dictates his last list, exacting terms for his funeral and burial. David Gray worked with Lindbergh to create the rainforest preserve here. He also helped bury him.
He had a casket made of local wood. He was dressed in garments that had no buttons or zippers. He had no shoes. He didn't want to pollute the environment. That sounds almost corny, but he didn't want to have anything going into the ground with him that wasn't him.
Lindbergh dies on August 26, 1974. His family follows his wishes to the letter, holding a small private ceremony and burying him within hours of his death.
I think he would have liked it sooner, but we did the best we could.
Not a single TV station nor big city paper is there to cover it.
öffentlichste Mann der USA.
It wasn't until this most public man of the United States was buried and the mourners had left that the first journalists set foot on the graveyard. That was the greatest victory of Charles Lindbergh over the media.
He had expected that his wife, Anne Morrow, would be buried with him. She made other arrangements, which her family has kept private. Charles Lindbergh lies on the far edge of America, alone.